Happy Monday, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining another edition of Office 365 Hours. And today we're going to talk about beyond provisioning. What does good Microsoft Teams governance look like? I know a lot of you have seen this word. Some of you may have just encountered it as you start adopting Teams. So we're going to unpack it in the next hour. And I'm so excited that we have all these experts in this call. So quickly, let's go around this virtual room and have you introduce yourself. So Haniel, why don't you quickly do an intro and tell everyone how you're making this world a better place?
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Haniel Croitoru. I'm based out of Toronto, Canada. I've been working with Microsoft Teams before it was actually launched. Quick adoption, found that it really lends itself well to working with individuals. The whole communication piece is great. Collaborating, working a lot on the go, right? Where I'm able to just pick up my phone and get to everything I need to do. It's just really intuitive, very easy.
Awesome. Thank you, Haniel. Sven?
Hi, my name is Sven Seidenberg. I'm based in Germany. I'm working as a consultant for Microsoft Teams. Adoption and change management is also part of my work, and all the Office 365 apps and services, and how to streamline your processes in those.
Awesome. JP?
Yeah, John Peluso, CTO of AvePoint Public Sector and Microsoft Regional Director. Really enjoying connecting to people in whatever way possible in this day and age. I have you all in together mode right now, so it seems like we're all just hanging out watching a good movie or something. But pretty significant time of disruption on a lot of levels. So really enjoying helping organizations try to find their way through and really navigate what is uncharted territory for some of them.
Thank you, JP. Thanks, everybody. And as Haniel, Sven, and JP has mentioned, Teams is an amazing platform. It helps enable us, especially during this time. Now, one of the conversations we're having a lot lately with customers and organizations that have quickly adopted Teams is how do we effectively govern it? So what I want to do is take a few minutes just to kind of walk through this idea of governance, why it's important, and then I'll open the floor up to colleagues in this session to kind of share ideas and best practices on how you can tackle it. But more importantly, for colleagues watching all over various social media channels, if you have any questions, pop it in. This is your opportunity to have experts address your questions, give you guidance. We're on LinkedIn live right now. If you want to ask questions, your best way is go to LinkedIn, go to AvePoint page and watch this stream, and you can pop in your questions as well. All right, so let me just jump right into it and talk about some of the basics of governance and why it's important. So maybe to better explain this, watch this quick video and then I'll walk through what it's all about. So who can relate to that? I've had tons of conversations in the past couple of weeks around how Teams is so amazing on how it can help with calling and chatting and collaboration. But at the same time, if there's really no guidelines in place, it could get out of hand. And this is what Gartner has been talking about 2-3 years ago on how Teams is a powerful platform, but without proper governance, it's going to create havoc and chaos and sprawl. So how should we think about governance from a perspective of Microsoft Teams? So for those not familiar, Microsoft Teams and other Microsoft Office 365 technologies is powered by a technology called Microsoft 365 Group. Think of Microsoft 365 Group as like a keychain that would hold different apps together in Office 365 and have the same set of people being able to take advantage of it. So this can assure consistency and, more importantly, assure security across the platform. So for example, when we create a team, this is what happens. So when a team gets created, and when I say a team, you're creating a team for the purposes of collaboration. This has nothing to do with calling or chats. Calling and chat is a separate piece of the capability, but specific to creating a team for collaboration, what happens actually behind the scenes is a Microsoft 365 group is created. In addition, a SharePoint site is created, so it helps provide a content service where you can store the documents and the files and create pages. An Outlook calendar is created for shared scheduling. A planner is created for task management, and also a shared OneNote notebook is created. Now, to some of you seeing this or realizing this for the first time, so what's the big deal? I mean, that's a cool thing about teams, right? You create a team, a bunch of different components and capabilities gets created. It's actually amazing. But one of the considerations you have to think about is, okay, once you create this thing, for example, where does information get stored? As I'm using it, who has access to it? Once I'm done with it, let's say the project is done, what happens to the information that's stored within this team? So for example, you may have a project document that's sitting on the SharePoint site where the file is being stored. Or what about those tasks that may have a file attached to it in Planner? And really, when you think about governance, it really follows through this life cycle and adoption, where I'm sure a lot of you out there, especially those who just started using Teams, because the last 3-4 months due to pandemic, Teams was quickly deployed and we're able to call and chat and start using Team for collaboration. And it's a natural progression where we piloted and did some rollout, but we're at a point now trying to figure out, okay, how do we make sure we make it easy for people to do the right thing? And that's what this conversation is about today. And when I talk about easy for people to do the right thing, this is the picture I always share. I have 2 wonderful children. My son, he's now 15. And I remember when he was much younger, when he was right around 4 or 5, the first time I took him bowling, I made sure that the guardrails were up. Now, real quick, I'm sure folks in this call, most of us have kids here. Why did you think I put the guardrails up in his first time bowling? JP, Haniel?
Avoid failure.
Yeah, I avoid failure. I want him to succeed, right? Although I explained the concept of bowling, he hasn't done it. So I made sure the guardrails are up so when he bowls, there's a higher likelihood of him hitting the pins, right? And, after a couple of tries, and he's like, I could do it now, put the guardrails down. I go, whatever, which I did. So what happened? It went to the gutter multiple times. He didn't hit any of the pins. And even worse, it hit the other person in the other lane. And I kid you not, that happened, right? And that's kind of the thinking around governance is Office 365 is a phenomenal platform. But just like any other new technology, we want to make sure we make it easy for people to do the right thing. And that's what governance is all about. Governance is not a bad thing. It is a good thing. And it's essentially putting those guardrails up where we identify, okay, for our organization, for specific departments, what guardrails do they need? So in this example, let's say Department A, they're legal. They can't do external sharing. What's their retention policies? Whereas Department B may be different, or Department C. And that's where we come in as technologists. We should tweak the environment so that the guardrails are well placed, specific to the organization. So with respect to governance, and we're going to unpack these 3 pieces here, what do I need to govern with Microsoft Teams? Really, to be practical about this, there's 3 core areas you need to think about. Number 1 is, how are teams being created? How are teams being requested, approved? Do you let people do it on their own? Or does IT have to do it? Or only select few can do it? Second is, once it's created, how do you think about people effectively managing their team and enforcing policy? So let's say I'm a project manager. Do I randomly invite people to join? Or can I just change the SharePoint permissions or create a bunch of subsites? How do you deal with that? And then last but not the least, how do you handle information retention, policy, and disposition? And for those that have SharePoint in the past, the last thing you want is having this sprawl where the team is not being used anymore and it's just there. Now, it's not even about storage, but there's a lot of compliance and regulations that we have to consider. So with this short intro, I hope this provided some context. I want to open the floor to colleagues in this call and start talking about ideas and best practices around governance beyond provisioning. So Haniel, why don't we get started with you? I know you do a lot of work, especially in your organization. You cover customers in the US and in Canada and other parts of the world. As you provide guidance to customers, let's start with step one, right? When they start using Teams, after calling, after chat, what are some of the basic guidelines that you offer around provisioning?
So it's a really good question, Dux. And often when we look at clients, as the typical consulting answer would be, it depends, right? Not the same governance fits every organization. We've worked with, for example, some academic organizations where their IT staff is very, very small. And so all of a sudden, if you're introducing governance that will inundate IT with requests, with information, that's going to have though it might be good from a governing point of view, it's going to have a negative impact on the organization. Other organizations, they may have a much larger team in place that are able to support it. Our general approach in terms of the adoption and the life cycle and the provisioning is give the users the ability to do self-service, but put the guardrails up. In other words, don't let them just go and create the teams and do whatever they want. What we like to do is have some sort of a provisioning process, which would say, you ask the user the basic questions, right? What's the name? What's the purpose? Who are the people who are going to be using it? And maybe pick from a set of templates or predefined structures. And then have a process in the background that actually does the provisioning. And most importantly, does not make that individual an owner. Because once you make somebody an owner, that's where everything falls apart. They think that by being owners, they should or they can do whatever they want. And often this is where you start to break down the model of the governance.
So Daniel, how does this process get conveyed? Is it through a training process, or do you have a checklist, or how does that work? And JP, we'll get back to you real quick.
So we try the checklist, we try the training, but if you give people the option, they often will just gravitate towards what's the easiest, and people don't like to read documents. And so actually enforcing governance, we found often is the best way. If there is no other way, right, you disable their ability to just go into Teams and create a team. And you say, if you want a team, you have to go and fill out this, form, whether it's a Power App or a different type of an app or something that will do the provisioning. That is typically the safest way. That's what we found.
John, you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great and very interesting point regarding ownership. One of the things those of us that have been around in the SharePoint world for years remember is the dead link, right? Hey, here's this great document. Let's collaborate on it. Link, boom. I don't have access. What happens, right? So the model in Office 365 and the model of Teams is very different, right? It is very easy to share in Teams and in Office 365 at large, which is really, really good when it's okay to be open.
Yeah.
But lots and lots of gaps when it's not okay to be open. So I know we're doing work right now with several large Office 365 tenants that have divisions inside where some are dealing with very sensitive topics. To their credit, they're doing it in Teams. They want that modern collaboration, but with a single Office 365 tenant, when you have different flavors of control that are needed, this is where I see a lot of customers bumping into challenge. And, Dux, as you know, this is where we have a lot of, engagements like this with our customers.
Yeah, and you make a really good point, John, because what I've seen also a lot of time happen is organizations, they roll out Office 365 and all of a sudden COVID hit and everybody says, we have to start working remote. Let's turn on Teams. Let's start collaborating. That's all good. But often what we find is security and compliance are an afterthought. And so what they've done now is they've effectively opened up their tenant to the entire world to share content, not being aware of how sensitive information is. We've seen organizations where all of a sudden really high sensitive documents are available to everybody in the organization. Why? Not because the technology is broken, but because they didn't know exactly what they were doing. And so now companies are coming to us and say, okay, right away, how do we disable external access? How do we disable guest access and sharing of content immediately to everybody so we can regroup and figure out what do we need to do and how do we do it the right way?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great point. And it's unfortunate because sometimes, right, you open this up and it's a phenomenal platform, but through negative experiences, then people have a negative view on it now, and then it affects your long-term adoption and use of this platform. It's like going to this your first date and you don't prepare, and then the date didn't work out well, so it's not going to happen again, right? But just to recap what you talked about, Haniel, for folks watching is you can be practical a lot. Number one is make sure that you have some processes in place, be it naming policy. You don't want random names in there. Think about how you train at least the basics within your organization, and it's only after they get trained and you provide the capability for them, if you want to have self-service creation. And again, that's the end goal. You want to do that. You don't want everything IT doing it forever, but guide them through, again, to make it easy for them to do the right thing. And the last thing I think Haniel talked about is, people always wants to use the easiest way. So if you provide 3 ways, then they'll just pick the easiest way, right? So ideally, if you can, at least their entry point to Teams is provide a single guidance in a single way and make it easy to get started. Yeah. So, okay. So now, we talked about provisioning. That's the governance around provisioning. Now people are using it. So what are some of the governance and guidance have you provided, Sven, especially working with customers out there in Germany? I'm sure you've interacted with some customers around the world. What are some of the common guidance you offer with respect to operational management or the use of Teams?
Yeah, we just talked about the naming policies for Teams, but they don't apply to channel names. So that's one thing we always talk about. What do you want to name your channels like? Also the scope of channels. We try to educate the users to choose the right scope of channels, so they don't end up with like 25 channels in each team and don't find stuff they're searching for. And also educate users on managing which users have access to your team, or do they still have access to their team? Same for guests. Do they still have access? Do they need access? And also manage which content is shared in your teams. So keep an eye on the content shared in even org-wide teams. Oftentimes there's content which should belong to a Yammer post or your formal intranet and not in a Teams channel. Those are some typical guidelines we offer. And also working on an internal etiquette guide for working with Teams. What do we want to do with which tool and which way, which is also important for people joining the company, because I experienced it myself 2 months ago. I was joining another company and they use Teams in a different way than my previous role. So I have to read their guidelines, to understand how they use it and why they do it this way. And that's something really important for new employees.
You said a couple important things here. So let's unpack that and let's ask everybody in this session. So first you talked about, how to create names and channels, where to put content, but I want to step back, right? So for folks in this session, how do you educate that, especially to the broad users, around all the functions and features of Teams? Because it could be overwhelming, right? Yeah. So if you're new to the platform, like, oh, okay, the document actually goes to SharePoint. When you create a task, it's a planner thing. Oh, when you're in SharePoint, you're a site collection admin. Don't muck up permissions. Don't create. It's a lot. So how do you go about by making it easy without going into all these complex details that only us IT geeks would have fun in? Anybody?
Well, I think often with these kind of rollouts, and again, this goes back to not depending too much on IT, is establishing a training and governance center of excellence. And this is really the place where you want to send your employees, your users to, where when they have the initial questions or when they want to understand how they should do something, that's where ideally they should go to, and they can find their curated materials, which are not going to be 1-hour videos or, like you mentioned, a 350-page governance document, but more small snippets that they can really easily digest and get to. Sven, you made a really good point around sometimes different organizations are using tools in different ways. And it's a question that I get from every single client is, when do I use OneDrive? When do I use SharePoint? When do I use Teams? What gets stored where and why and how? And so starting off the journey with Teams with some very clear training and adoption, and not stopping there, but rather revisiting again and again and seeing how the tools are being used and adopted over time to really make sure that people understand that, hey, you're sharing with an individual, guess what? That's going to be in OneDrive for Business, because that's where Teams is going to put it for you. You need to share that with a greater audience, move it into your team, into your channel, or if you're working in SharePoint, move it into the SharePoint, right? So lots of training, lots of adoption. There has to be that it's a journey, right? It's not a switch. It's not a, often you talk about a rollout or implementation where, okay, there's launch date, and after that, adios, I'm on to my next thing. Can happen. You have to really walk your users through it.
Now, speaking of etiquette guide, for friends watching, our other good friend, Matt Wade, MVP, wrote an awesome Microsoft Teams etiquette guide. You can download and tailor it for your organization. Just look up, Matt Wade Teams etiquette guide, so you'll be able to use that. Sorry, John, I think I cut you off there.
No, it's perfect. I was actually going to bring up the fact that I think it's two directional, right? It's bi-directional. There's the top-down education and planning, but really what we experienced, and I think what is sometimes more valuable than a message across the organization, especially in a large company, you may find that different teams internally, right, lowercase t teams, by the way, different teams internally will naturally take to Teams differently. There are some very high structured collaboration patterns where a highly structured team makes sense. There's others where a little bit more grassroots type of style. Development organizations will use Teams differently than sales organizations and marketing organizations. I think what makes sense is to try to build, and this is something you'll see Microsoft echo as well, build those champions within each of those segments of the business. We started using Teams, as Dux well knows, I think maybe 2 weeks after the preview launched. And within the first 10 days, I had people adding me to a team that was centered around a particular customer. I had other people creating a team for a specific opportunity with a customer. I had other people creating teams for the entire field team. It was very confusing, and talk about fatigue and not being able to find your way around. You brought up, someone brought up earlier, it's like a circle of excellence kind of concept. I think building and cultivating those best practices and advertising them throughout the organization is really key, because it gives the flexibility for teams to work in a way that's natural to them, but at the same time gives people really good ideas. And then the other thing you need is some policing of that, right? So those community champions, right, end up being the ones that say, hey, let's guide the conversation back over here. Hey, there's a channel set up for this. Hey, I noticed that this conversation is spilling out into a chat. Maybe we should go and continue it into the conversation in the team channel so that everyone else can see. It's I think that kind of grassroots progress really makes sense as well.
As all of you were talking about providing context and guidance and adoption, I'm sure a lot of you are also alluding to this other layer, right? To make it easy for people to do the right thing, in addition to talking about function and features, if you're sharing a file for others, put it in Teams. Also wrap it around the context of the business use case. So Microsoft recently already announced that you can have some templating capability for Microsoft Teams and the ability to quickly provision teams around a specific template. And when we think about templates, we think about business use cases and processes. So for example, instead of just providing a way where people can create teams and figure out the channels and the tabs and what have you, why not map it to a process around what they do, like project management, for example? So in a scenario like this, right, where internal projects, you pre-create all the channels, the tabs, and the necessary files, And then when you educate the project management team, you connect it to what they do. Okay, folks, now that we have Microsoft Teams, when we work on our project, when we do project kickoff, create a team. Now, when we're doing project execution, we use Planner to track tasks. So you map the feature and function to the day in, day out work that they do. And then, in addition to this, as IT, as they're using it, we can wrap around the policies around it. And this is certainly something you can do through Office 365 capabilities, Azure capabilities, and third-party capabilities where you want to make it easy for them. So now that project managers or the project teams using this, you put capability so that they won't do external sharing, for example, or you limit the type of document that gets uploaded. And you put expiration, for example, where once the project is done, 60 days later, get rid of it. So this is, I think, one of the effective ways where once you onboard folks to Teams and have them use it, wrap around their business purpose around it, and automate policies that as much as you can, so that they can avoid any mishaps.
Yeah. So Dux, I think we've probably all seen this out there, right? There's been this surge in usage of Teams because people need to work remotely with each other. They need to connect. They need to have these kind of meetings like we're having. But what we're seeing as an artifact of that is, while we have, good Teams adoption in terms of people visiting the application, are they really leveraging all of the collaboration features that they can? I think what we're seeing is a lot of one-to-one chats and a lot of maybe video meetings potentially. We're not seeing a lot of meetings in channels with all the value that brings. We're not seeing the unified communications piece of Teams as bound closely together as to the collaboration as can be really useful. We do this demo in our workshop sometimes that starts with a communication, escalates to a screen share, escalates to a meeting where you bring other people, right? These are the common patterns that we know exist. So what I think the real value of those templates are, again, if we take it not just a broad centralized deployment, which makes sense, what we're looking to do is you want to create gravity, right? Gravity means the user is pulled into Teams because that's where their data is and that's where their work streams are being executed. It is, in some ways, not realistic to think that a new tool like Teams, someone will learn how to use, but also learn the information architecture of in a few short weeks, right? It doesn't happen. I could tell you plenty of people who have no idea how SharePoint should be architected, right? Do I need a site? Do I need a list? Do I need a library? Do I need a subsite? So let's for the moment give them some examples by working with the business and saying, what are those repeatable collaboration patterns that lend themselves to a team? And let's help them by creating them. People learn how to use Teams by using Teams. Right? Let's not make the creation a barrier. Let's, in addition to giving them some self-service capabilities, really identify those high-value targets, like those templates that you were talking about, incident response teams, things like that. I think this is really where people start to learn, and then they'll get the idea. Oh, I could adapt this, and I could work with my other team this way too.
Sven, what are some of the common use cases that you've seen in your customers, or at least you introduce on how they can use Teams for collaboration?
A really common use case is in the marketing department, working with other marketing companies together, sharing files. Often they use email for this and can't find files, can't find information. Give them a team with external access or guest access, and they will be happy. Structuring it in channels, everything is good. Some other departments are the product management or product development, which are all often pretty motivated to adopt those tools as a first adopter. HR is also oftentimes a department which likes to use tools like that for video conferences to get to know new or potential employees. Those are some low-hanging fruits you can count on.
In Haniel, any recent projects you worked on, especially new deployment of Teams, that some interesting use cases or your customer, at least the business audience, were like, wow, this is actually going to change how we work for the better?
I think it really depends on where they are in terms of the adoption scale. For some of the clients, they were literally just rolling out Teams. For them, everything would have told us like, oh, we didn't know this. This is great. You mean I can use this on my phone? And actually, for one of the clients where they have a lot of frontline workers and they didn't realize that, yeah, you don't have to have all this Office 365 nonsense, which to them is nonsense, on your device. You just need Teams, and guess what? You can talk to your supervisor. You can chat with them. You can, you can get to the documents. You can do everything from your handheld device. Like, that was a very, very useful use case. In the past, it used to be that either they have to log into the intranet, or they have to use the SharePoint app. And then if they want to go to documents, then they had to look at the OneDrive app. They wanted to go to email, now they had to go to Outlook. So that I found was a very good use case that our clients was kind of really excited about.
You bring something up that I noticed it has been a barrier for a lot of people to grasp what Teams is. So if you think about it, right? Like as consumers, or even in our day-to-day lives, everybody's so used to a one-trick pony app. Like, an app can only do one thing, right?
Right.
And oftentimes I feel that it's not fair where Teams is being compared to Zoom, because now you made the impression that all Teams does is video calls.
Not at all, right?
Right. And then sometimes Teams is being compared to Box or Dropbox, which now you're thinking Teams is file sharing, or Slack is just that group chat. And no matter how many times you tell people it does all of them, it's hard for people to grok unless they start using it, as John pointed out, right?
It's interesting you say that, because I almost see a parallel between Teams and SharePoint. If you think back around the days of SharePoint 2010, SharePoint was positioned as a developer's platform. It was an ECM system, but you could really customize it, web parts, and you could do all these really cool things. And then over time, Microsoft has kind of toned down the story and said, okay, SharePoint is your ECM. That is where you manage your documents, your versions, your records, and everything. We got that. Now we have essentially a new generation of a tool, which is Teams, which, it's a hub, it's a dashboard. It is a collection of functionality that comes from many places. You mentioned groups before, Dux, right? So we've got the communication, and we've got the documents, and we've got the security and planner and calendar. We got all of these elements kind of nicely packaged together. And one thing we didn't talk about is the whole apps and the expansion, the customization of it, which again, it is like the SharePoint 2010 story where it used to be a development platform. Although Teams is not being marketed as that, it definitely has the capabilities. And again, when I go back to the story around mobile, if you think about the frontline workers who make up actually a majority of the workforce, and they're often underserviced, all of a sudden you're creating this tool that you can really put in their hands, one-stop shop to do their daily work. Like, I think that is really a compelling story.
Yeah. There's a feedback here from LinkedIn from Andrew. He's just making a comment. He likes the idea of templates, pass on best practices so people don't have to reinvent the wheel. And the point around Teams being a platform is, the organization just has to make sure they still have the right level of resource, right? While you don't need full-on devs, but you still need people that would really understand the capability of extending it. Now you may even be talking about hooking a Power Platform or building bots, which is not hardcore coding, but still, whoever's going to be involved in this should know some level of integration across the different Microsoft technologies.
Yeah, and actually Microsoft is really taking a lot of steps to simplify it. Just recently, over the last few months, Microsoft has now released a capability where you can build you mentioned Power Platform, you can build a Power App, and once you put it inside of Teams, it is not just a shell, but it is actually aware of the team or the channel that it is sitting in, and based on that, you can actually set up the behavior of it so that it really feels and acts in a much more integrated experience.
So it's not just an iframe, right?
Not anymore. That's what it used to be in the past. It used to be just Teams was your essentially your container, and your Power App used to be just your functionality that is sitting without Teams. But if you wanted to do anything that is relevant to Teams, you have to then go and select the team you're in, select the channel you're in, and do everything as if you were using it outside. It was just a container. Today, that story has changed, and it continues to become more and more integrated over time.
Absolutely. And it's not just Power Apps alone. Even SharePoint is having the same thing. Now they're improving Yammer now. The new Yammer app within Teams can interact with Teams. So talking about all this, right? So now let's kind of look at the third pillar of governance. So we talked about, think about how you want to govern the provisioning and creation of these teams. Second is, as you're using, how do you govern the use and enforcing policies? The third pillar is information lifecycle. So how should we think about the lifecycle information, especially if it's a team that's being used for temporary endeavors, like projects, for example? So JP, I know you work a lot with government agencies, and government agencies highly regulated. Records management is important. Information lifecycle is critical. So what are some guidance can you offer to our viewers today?
I think, and I know we want to move on to that third pillar of lifecycle, but before we do, I think one thing that we definitely have to connect the dots on. We talked at the beginning about kind of the open sharing that is kind of the model of the Office 365 platform. It is critical that as part of the ongoing management, you have some plan for the review or the verification of permissions and memberships. I know I have a group that literally it's designed to service a field team of about 35 users. I went and visited it, a few months ago, and there were 108 users in the team. Because, at some point in time, we needed someone to participate in this chain or this thread. And these normal, it's fine, it's great, it happens, right? But what is the process? Permissions are easy to give, but how do we review them? And I think you see similar options in SharePoint. If you couple teams with the member sharing capabilities in SharePoint Online, meaning any member can share with anyone, it gets really difficult as a team owner to really understand the scope of who your information is shared with. So I think that's where organizations do need to double down, because it is not easy. If you know you're supposed to go to SharePoint and view the sharing permissions, it's still not easy. Right? Forget about a standard user. So that's something that you should think about. Fortunately or unfortunately, permissions management has always been a SharePoint issue that, has been top of mind. It continues to be. So don't forget that that's still there. Now, on the end of life side of the fence, I do think it's important for you to start to think about, what is the purpose of teams, right? Are these departmental teams that will be long-standing? Or as you mentioned, is this a project team? Because if it's a project team and the project is over, okay, how do I handle the decommissioning of that workspace? We have tools available at our disposal to do things like ensure that content within that team can be retained indefinitely, but is that the approach you want to take? Because that would mean that team needs to exist indefinitely. So there's options. There's options to get that data somewhere else, right? Store it long-term there. If you have, engagements with customers where you need to supply a copy of the data from that team, that's something that you should think about as well, right? What does that decommissioning process look like? Right now, as we mentioned at the outset, it's an owner, right? The owner pretty much has the ability to decide these things.
You'd find, though, John, or at least I've seen this happen many times, where organization, even in today's age where they have SharePoint, they've been using it for a while, they don't have a proper record retention policy in place. And what happens is when they start adopting teams, they're just inheriting the bad habits. In other words, once a team is created, leave it there. We may need to access this document 10 years from now, so you can't touch it, leave it where it is. And the problem is that it really opens it up to potential compliance issues, regulatory, and if God forbid they're ever sued, guess what? Everything that they have is now open to the lawyers.
Yeah.
So that's where I think it's important to work with organizations who don't have that retention structure in place to help them get there, and then enforce that within Office 365, within Teams.
Speaking of regulation and compliance, I want to jump to Sven, because we know where you're at. Things like GDPR is critical. The good news is, as a platform, Microsoft 365 has capabilities to comply with GDPR, but it's still up to you to configure it for your organizations, right? So what are some of the guidance you offer around retention, around right to forget, especially around GDPR, Sven?
Yeah. There are some features for Microsoft for the right to forget, GDPR. There's even a GDPR dashboard where you can see how compliant your company as a tenant is, and what you should enable to be compliant. And there are some really good guidance for the GDPR dashboard. But one thing you should always think about is the third-party apps. It's great to have those integrations in Teams as a tab or as an app in Teams, but each third-party app can be GDPR compliant or not, and you have to check each one, or you disable every app, and then check it one by one if users ask for it. Definitely something to think about if GDPR is something you have to care about in your company, I guess.
Yeah, Sven, that's a great point, and I think Microsoft is investing in the space of, if you look increasingly within the Teams admin center, you'll see publisher attestations or certifications for different Teams apps. So that's an interesting space. Certainly, as an ISV, we're watching that and looking to participate in that. Just giving organizations a way to feel somewhat comfortable that at least data is available for their review about how that third-party application handles data. The certification aspect is a really interesting one. Curious to see how that comes off, right? This is almost a stamp of approval that the third-party app is doing things right. So it'll be an interesting space to watch move forward.
John, I would have to ask you, working in the U.S. public sector in the recent months, we've seen a lot of U.S. government agencies just not only go to the cloud, like embrace Teams. There's a recent story around the Department of Defense, like in a span of 3 weeks, had millions and millions of users on Teams.
Well, I think so if you look at that as an example, I think it mirrors what we've all been seeing over the last several months. If you would have asked DoD before February, before March, hey, do you want to squeeze everybody into one environment and we'll just sort of let them work in there? We'll advise them not to really upload a lot of documents, but does that sound good, right? You'd get no way, right, as an answer. But need drives usage and scenario, right? And so here was a need to have external collaboration and remote collaboration, and we're all in a process now of figuring out what does this look like after the surge. How do we get this thing now in a sustainable long-term approach? So I think it has been fascinating to watch that surge, and if it can happen in the U.S. DoD, it's happening in organizations all around the world as well.
Well, I'd like to comment on that, John, because actually one thing, so being in Canada, I've worked with a number of clients and also in Europe and even in the Middle East. There's organizations who are a bit hesitant to move to Teams completely into Office 365 because of the data residency. So although you can have your SharePoint data reside in most data centers today, and Teams as well, there's some data, I believe, Planner, Forms, they always reside in the US. And because some data resides in the US, no offense to anyone, but right away they say, you know what, it's not compliant with our laws, we cannot move to the cloud, full stop. So right. I know in Canada we have 2 data centers, and there's still stories around, okay, well, maybe some organizations, what they do is they actually enable Teams, they enable SharePoint, they turn off Forms. You cannot use Forms. Why? Because it's not residing in Canada. So I think that the GDPR is part of it. You can control, forget your data. Apps can get certified. But even when you're working with third-party apps, even if all of Microsoft would be stored in your local country, you still run the risk of some of these apps not being compliant, not because they are malicious by any means, but because the data is not residing in your country.
And that's exactly what we saw with U.S. government environment, right? Because U.S. government has multiple environments. I mean, being in the U.S. obviously it's important, but then having it separate than the commercial tenant is another factor. And I'm sure we're going to start seeing this in other governments around the world as well.
Yeah.
Now, so this, it's a lot of good stuff, a lot of good conversations for folks watching. I know an hour won't do this justice. Feel free to download this ebook. It's called Using and Tailoring Microsoft Teams for Your Organization. We hit on a lot of the topics that we just discussed. It's free. Download it. Learn a lot out of you learn a lot out of what we've just been talking about. But before we wrap up, I want to go around the room again one more time, and for each person to provide one quick tip with respect to governance. So when we think about making it easy for people to do the right thing, what's a proven tactic or tip that you've done or you've advised for your customers that work really well, right? One tip to make it easy for people to do the right thing. So let's start with Sven.
I think a general tip is to balance both sides of the governance. Don't take everything away from the end user. Don't take away the self-service adoption and the capabilities of the end user to use the Teams tool like he wants to or like he should do. But on the other side, providing the IT the possibility to stay in charge of the environment. Keep this in balance and ask your end users what they need, what they want.
Very good. So keep a good balance and empower them, but also guide them. Awesome. Haniel?
Yeah, so I'll build on what Sven just said. With great power comes great responsibility. And I know, John, you mentioned before the idea of having your champions. I'm a true believer in having the champions. The one thing you got to make sure is that these champions are all going to be following the same guidance, the same advice, the same rules that are set out within the organizations. Because otherwise what you might have is a little following of bad practices, which is then just going to mushroom. So that's just one thing I wanted to add.
Awesome. All right, JP.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give the public sector and the heavily regulated organizations spin, which is to try to partner with those teams that are going to be building the governance requirements or mandating those governance requirements, because the more that they are approaching the system and the governance of the Office 365 system with a sense of what is actually possible. The worst is where you get governance mandates that come down that are not actually enforceable, right? So be that voice of education about what and how is possible, rather than simply accepting we must do X, Y, or Z. You're going to have to, especially in regulated organizations, the buck stops there, right? You're going to have to be able to offer it, but if you can give them the confidence of what's possible and how it can be controlled, you're going to land in a better place.
Absolutely. And then for me is going back to we spoke at length about, right? Ties back to what Sven says. So at the end of the day, while Teams is a great platform, it's a tool. So how can this enable your colleagues, your business to get their job done faster, better, sooner? So shape it around helping them be more productive, collaborate better, and communicate better, and focus on a very specific use case. And from that point onwards, as John mentioned, then light bulbs will start popping. Angels will start singing. Oh, I could do it for this. I could do it for that, right? So
comment on Dux's profile for that one. I don't.
Angel singing? Well, that may be a different tool. But with that, friends, thank you so much. I hope you found this session beneficial, and I encourage everybody to join us in future Office 365 hours. If you have topics you want us to tackle, let me know. But here are all the upcoming sessions. We have a session on Power Platform, how do we do extensibility in Teams, as Haniel brought up earlier, and how do we use Microsoft Stream. So we have tons of session every 2 weeks, very informal. We bring experts in to just chat about best practices. So with that, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you Sven, Haniel, and John for joining us. And if you all want to contact us, feel free, you know where to get us. Other than that, have a great week, wash your hands, and stay safe. We'll see you. Bye.
Ciao everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.